All right, Chapter 22, The Ordeal of Reconstruction, and this will be 1865 to 1877. So when we're talking about Reconstruction, we're meaning reconstructing the South. So the Civil War analogy would be like you have this vase, and you threw it on the ground and it broke into a million pieces. That vase is the South. Okay, so we're learning how we're gonna glue the pieces of the South back together. So the intro, okay, now that the war is over, there's kind of four big questions out there. One would be, how would the South, devastated by war and socially revolutionized by emancipation of the slaves, how would that be rebuilt? How would we put those pieces back together? Okay. How would the newly freed slaves fare? What would happen to them? Another third question would be, how would the southern states be reintegrated into the Union? Are they automatically states again? Do they have to jump through some hoops? How does that work? And then one of the biggest questions we'll be really looking at in this chapter is who, as in, is it Congress, the president, the southern states themselves? Who will lead the process of Reconstruction? Who's going to get to decide how to piece together that broken vase? So that's kind of where we're going this chapter, Reconstruction, gluing that vase back together. Okay, Section A, the problems of peace. What do we do with Confederate leaders? Jefferson Davis, who of course was the president of the Confederate States, he was more or less thrown into jail. He sat there for about 2 years, and then finally, kind of as a Christmas present, in 1868, President Johnson pardons all Confederate leaders. So Johnson, a couple years later, 68, he pardons all Confederate leaders. The South was looking dismal. It was broken. It's a whole way of life collapsed, both economically and socially. Cities like Charleston, Richmond, Atlanta, they're just rubble. They're just waste. They're rubble. Factories are dismantled. There's runaway inflation, which means a dollar just won't buy as much as it used to. And because of this inflation, money not really holding its value, a lot of banks, a lot of businesses just kind of give up and shut their doors. Transportation, as always, kind of in the South, is horrible. Remember Sherman on his march to the sea, going through Georgia and South Carolina. He would pull up railroad tracks, heat them up, bend them into weird shapes. So it's a struggle to, get the railroads back in place. So that's very shaky. For agriculture, many of these cotton fields are more or less weeds now. Haven't been touched for a couple of years. Slavery's gone. How are we going to bring our cotton fields back to life without the slave economy? And then also a lot of the Yankees or Northern Union soldiers had taken the livestock of the Southern planters as kind of, treasure of war. So a lot of the Southerners were without their livestock, so they couldn't plow their fields because they didn't have their horse or their ox, that sort of thing. There's some records of people trying to, strap the plow on themselves and pull it through to make it work. Obviously, that wasn't a wonderful idea, but people were desperate. It was a hard time. Okay, so wealthy planters, of course, they had invested a lot of money into slaves. I think it was $1,400 for a slave back in the day, and now all of that investment's gone. A lot of these lovely southern mansions we think of with the white pillars, all of that stuff, a lot of those had been plundered. People stole a lot from them. Also, a lot of them were charred and kind of just burned, just kind of left as a mess. And Southerners, although they had stopped fighting, they had lost the war, they really had still, they were defiant about it. They thought they had fought for a good reason, and it was a just cause, and harbored a lot of hard feelings against the North. So there's a lot of problems that we have to solve. All right, next section, Section B, Freedmen's defined freedom. Okay, so a freedman is literally a slave who is now free, a free man, so freedmen. So freedmen define freedom. Okay? Emancipation of the slaves, it wasn't like one day all the slaves were free. That's not how it worked. Okay, it was a gradual process. Because remember, the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln had signed said that all slaves in the rebellious states were free. So when Union soldiers during the war had gone deeper and deeper into the South, the area those soldiers would go, that would be the area slaves would be freed. So sometimes a slave would get their freedom and then be re-enslaved, and then get their freedom and then be re-enslaved. There's one account of a South Carolina slave who had been given his freedom and re-enslaved about 12 times. So it kind of just depended where the troops were at the time. So yes, we'll just keep going. I don't have to tell you every single detail here. Okay. Some slave owners, of course, not wanting to free their slaves, complained that emancipation wasn't legal until the Supreme Court or the states decided it to be so. So we really see a lot of different reactions, especially from the slaves, because some slaves were loyal to their masters and really resisted the liberating Union Army when they came. Other slaves, when they were freed, they went for the revenge. There is a instance of one Virginia slave who gave his former master 20 lashes on the back and then went forth to pillage his home, the master's home. So it really depended on the person, how they kind of took to this idea of freedom. But eventually all masters were induced or were made to recognize that their slaves were permanently free. So what they would usually do, they would call all the slaves to the big house, the master's house, and announce their freedom. A lot of slaves were very suspicious, very uncertain. Are you for real? You're letting us go? Is this, what's going on here? All right, so once they did kind of come to the realization, I am free, there was a couple things they did. Sometimes they would change their names because their names had been given by their masters and they wanted their own name. They'd change their names. They would demand to be called Mr. or Miss so-and-so, kind of that title of respect. A lot of them, though, really just hit the road. One, to kind of test their freedom. I can just go wherever. And also to find lost loved ones. Remember, especially in the northern part of the South, a lot of times the families would be divided and some would be sold down the river. So people went in search of their loved ones. Okay. A lot of black communities formed. So if you were to leave the plantation where you were working, where you were enslaved, a lot of times a whole group of slaves would move together, and they'd form new communities, a lot of times in larger towns. And in these communities, the heart of these communities would oftentimes be churches, especially Methodist churches, Baptist churches. They'd just be kind of the hub of that community. There would be a lot of charitable organizations that form out of there. It was kind of the heart of the black community were these new churches. Another thing on the top of their list, once they got their freedom, was to get an education. Of course, it was illegal in a lot of the southern states to learn how to read and write. So now they were really hungry. The slaves were really hungry. Freedmen, I should say, are really hungry for education. One is they want to read the Bible, and two is they really wanted to close that gap between themselves and other whites in the South. They really wanted to become educated, and they felt that learning to read and write would help them. Good to go. The problem with that, though, with the schools was the fact that there wasn't a lot of educated blacks in the South to become the teachers. So there is a group called the American Missionary Association who would actually send white women from the North down into the South to become teachers at these schools. All right, so continuing on that kind of vein, that thought, Section C, the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? The Freedmen's Bureau is more or less the federal government's response to helping all of these emancipated blacks. Okay? A lot of the former slaves didn't know how to survive outside of slavery. It was a very foreign idea to them. A lot of them were unskilled. course, they're uneducated, they were out without money, they were without property, so they really did need some help. Like I said, what the federal government created was something called the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? And that was created March 3rd, 1865. It was headed by a former Union general. His name was General Oliver O. Howard, and Howard, or General Howard, I should say, had always been very sympathetic to the plight of the blacks, so he did a pretty good job setting that up. They were supposed to, this bureau was to provide food, provide clothing, medical care, education to both blacks and whites who had been displaced by war. And like anything, the Bureau had its good sides and, the bad, the good and the bad. The best thing that really happened with the Bureau is education. It's estimated that the Bureau, through the efforts of the Bureau, about 200,000 freedmen learned how to read and to write. So that was probably its shining glory there, was education. But it really didn't, it really wasn't enough. Okay? A part of the idea of this Bureau was to divvy out 40-acre chunks of land that had been confiscated by the Confederacy and give those 40-acre chunks to freedmen. And that just never happened. So a lot of the things that they set out to do just weren't successful, but it's kind of just what the federal government attempted to do to help these freedmen. So the Freedmen's Bureau eventually just kind of went away in 1872 when it was up to be reinstated, or the act was supposed to be passed again. It never did. So in 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau just kind of disappeared. So not a whole lot of good stuff in place for those freed blacks. Okay, next section, Section D. Johnson, the Taylor president. Okay, Johnson was VP for Lincoln, and since Lincoln was shot, he is now president. A little background on Johnson. He was from a poor North Carolina family, orphaned at an early age. He never went to school, but when he was about 10, he was an apprentice to a tailor. Thus the title of this section, Johnson, the Taylor president. So he was really considered himself a self-made man. He taught himself how to read. His wife taught him how to write. They moved to, when he was 17, he moved to Tennessee and started getting involved in politics. Eventually, he was elected to Tennessee's Congress, and his whole deal was he was for the poor whites against those ruthless, evil planter elite. So he was very much against the planter elite in the South. So when the Civil War happened, when Tennessee, the state he was a congressman from, seceded, he refused to recognize this, and he was actually the only Southern congressman to stay in Congress during the war. Yes, okay. But Johnson was a misfit. First thing was, he was from the South, but the people in the South distrusted him because he had stayed loyal to the Union during the war. And he just really didn't understand, the Northern ways. He just didn't get it. Okay? Also, remember, he's a Democrat. And everyone else, pretty much, in Washington are Republicans. Most of Congress are Republicans. All of the cabinet, or his group of advisors that he had inherited from Lincoln, were Republican. So he was definitely a misfit, to say the least. He was kind of in the wrong place, the wrong time. All right, next section, Presidential Reconstruction. So at the beginning of this chapter, remember I mentioned we're still trying to debate who is going to glue these pieces of the broken vase, which is the South, together. Okay? Is it going to be the president? Is it going to be Congress? Who's going to do it? So this is kind of like the president's ideas. This section is the president's ideas. All right, so arguments over Reconstruction has started even before the war ended, which means President Lincoln, before he was shot, kind of had a game plan. And Lincoln's game plan was something called the 10% Reconstruction Plan. 10% Reconstruction Plan. And that said that states could re-enter the Union when 10% of its voters would take an oath of allegiance to the U.S. and pledged to go along with emancipation. And of course, your state had to have a formal government in place. So it was fairly lenient, right? Only 10% of the state had to agree to really re-enter the Union, or had to agree to take an oath of alliance to the U.S. So kind of the South would have gotten off fairly easily with that. Okay. The Republicans in Congress, however, were really fearful that Lincoln's plan was too lenient, too easy on them, and that it would more or less just restore what had been in place before the war, would have just restored this kind of planter aristocracy. So, in Congress, in response to Lincoln's 10% plan, passed their own plan, and this is 1864. They passed something that's called the Wade-Davis Bill. The Wade-Davis Bill increased the amount of people who had to take this oath of loyalty. So instead of 10% like Lincoln, they said 50%. So 50% of voters had to take the oath of allegiance. And what Lincoln did, this bill, the Wade-Davis Bill, Congress passed it, and never became law because Lincoln never signed it. Okay? He did something called a pocket veto. Remember, a veto is rejecting a bill. A pocket veto is kind of like when you get a text message from somebody asking you if you want to, meet at a coffee shop later tonight. But instead of saying outright texting back no, or outright texting back yes, what you do is you just kind of ignore the text, and then by default it's kind of like an automatic no, right? So pocket veto is the same sort of thing. Lincoln's not going to sign it, but he's not going to outright reject it. He's just going to let it kind of sit there until it goes away. So Lincoln gets the Wade-Davis Bill, he sets it on the shelf, and he waits till that session of Congress is done with, or until Congress goes into a recess. So more or less the bill dies, but he doesn't have to outright reject it. So that's what he does with the Wade-Davis Bill. And what's important about this is it's really showing kind of the difference in perspectives we see between the President Lincoln, and Congress. And it's really how he's perceiving these states that had the southern states. Okay, so Lincoln, he wanted the states to be restored to the Union just simply and swiftly. Okay, in his mind, Lincoln's mind, he's seeing the seceded states as never legally being outside of the Union. On the flip side, Congress, especially this group we'll talk about later, the radical Republicans in Congress, they see the opposite, more or less. The radical Republicans feel like the South really needs to pay, really needs to feel the pain that they had left the Union, they had forfeited their rights, and they could only re-enter the Union as conquered entities, as conquered states. So really you see that difference of perspective between Lincoln, who's kind of softer on the South, and Congress, especially the radical Republicans, which we'll talk about, as being a lot harsher. They want them to feel the pain a little bit. Okay. Of course, Lincoln is killed. We've talked about that a little bit. Ford's Theater. Andrew Johnson takes over. Andrew Johnson, of course, from Tennessee, a congressman from Tennessee. He was from the South, but remember, his whole thing was he hated the planter aristocracy. So although Johnson was from the South, a lot of people thought he'd be really harsh on the South because he had that hatred for the Southern aristocracy, and they thought he wouldn't want that to come around again. However, Johnson kind of surprised people by more or less adopting Lincoln's plan. Remember Lincoln's 10% plan? Johnson more or less just changes it a little bit, just tweaks it a little bit. So this is Johnson's plan. Johnson is going to disfranchise, which means kind of like to take away the right to vote. He's going to disfranchise certain Confederate leaders. However, if the Confederate leaders wrote to him personally, he would be willing to pardon people, and he did that by the thousands. He pardoned a lot of ex-Confederate leaders. So he's disenfranchising some Confederate leaders. He also says each state needs to hold a convention and formally repeal their act of secession. And then they need to they need to know that the United States government is not going to assume any of the debt the southern states had incurred during the Civil War. Because remember, war is expensive, and the South was, up to its eyeballs in debt. So President Johnson's like, hey, guess what? We're not going to assume a penny of that debt. That's going to be up to the states in the South to take care of. And also, he wanted to make sure that the southern states would ratify the 13th Amendment. Okay, remember the 13th Amendment was the amendment that abolished slavery. So he wanted them to do that as well. So here's the deal. Although it seems like a lot of steps, okay, ratifying the 13th Amendment, repealing secession, disfranchising some leaders, refusing to accept their debts. That may seem like a lot to us, but really, they had just fought a war. People had died. The radical Republicans in Congress were mad. They're like, no way, because all Johnson's plan's doing in their eyes is just reinstating the planter aristocracy. It's like, why did we fight a war if you're just going to let them kind of socially and economically just take power again? They weren't happy. Which brings us to the next section, Section F, the baleful black code. Something that's baleful or kind of like something you regret or that's sad. The sad black codes. Codes being another word. Codes being code for laws. So these are laws. Okay. So now that the planter elite, at least through Johnson's 10% plan that he adopted from Lincoln, now that the planter elite were restored to political power, they started to pass something called black codes. These were laws passed in the South that restricted the rights of the emancipated blacks. Planters knew that they had to start plowing through those weeds, had to start farming again, and they wanted a really tight grasp on their labor force. A lot of times blacks would sign a 1-year contract to work at a pitiful amount of money, for not a lot of money, with their former masters. So they'd sign a contract 1 year, I'm going to work for you for the X amount of money. And what would happen is if they jumped the contract or if they left before that 1 year was up, there were people out there actually called Negro catchers who would go hunt them down and literally drag them back to fulfill that 1 year contract. So it's awful. It feels an awful lot like the people who would go and catch escaped slaves. So not the best situation for the blacks. Some of the codes included they couldn't serve on a jury. Some of them were prevented from renting land. Some codes said that they couldn't vote. Eventually, the worst of the codes were repealed, but still, they were not economically liberated. Politically, sure, the blacks were liberated, but really not economically speaking. Because what happened, and we'll talk about this a little bit next chapter, is a system of sharecropping. And this was how it would work. A lot of times, the freedmen, or the emancipated slaves, would continue to live where they had when they were slaves. What they would do is, in exchange for the land and the farm materials and housing, in exchange for that, they would sign a contract saying, I'll give, 1/3 to a half of all of my crop to my former master at the end of the year when it comes harvest time. But then they also would go to a local merchant and they would borrow some more. They would borrow money for food, for clothing, for seeds, that sort of thing. So they'd borrow money from the merchants and say, once harvest time comes around, I'll pay you back plus a little bit of interest. Well, the deal was that a lot of times when it came time from harvest, you're giving 1/3 or half of it to the landowner, to your former master, and then you're giving another chunk plus interest to the local merchants. When all was said and done, you're either left with hardly anything, or two, which is the more likely scenario, you would actually be further in debt. So you would be stuck there, of course, until you could pay that debt off. But year after year, instead of getting ahead, you'd get behind. You become further and further into debt. So sharecropping, not the best situation, but it's a situation a lot of blacks kind of fell into because they didn't really know what else to do, didn't really have any more opportunities other than that. So now the North seeing these black codes kind of limiting the rights of African Americans, and seeing this system of sharecropping, which looked an awful lot like slavery, they were wondering to themselves, who really won the war here? I thought we fought this war to emancipate the blacks, and now they're more or less in the same boat with, different terms. So yeah, so next we're going to be talking a little bit about Congressional Reconstruction, but I think this is enough for this video.